So now we're into the 1800s, and children had even more literary options available to them. So early in the 19th century, the Grimm brothers published children and household tales, which included stories that you probably know, like Sleeping Beauty, as well as Cinderella. And the Grimm brothers were actually scholars. They didn't make up these stories. They collected these stories from the people of Europe, such as people living in Germany. And the stories that they collected and put in this book were actually very old stories that have been told for many generations and passed down via word of mouth. However, Hans Christian Andersen, who published fairy tales told for children several decades later, those fairy tales in his book, which included The Ugly Duckling and The Emperor's New Clothes, were actually stories that he made up. So what the Grimm brothers wrote would be an example of traditional literature, old stories that were passed down by word of mouth for generations. And we're going to talk about some of those distinctions between modern-day fairy tales and folklore when we get to that unit later on in this semester. But for now, know that children had fairy tales and folk tales available to them at that time. So other books that are considered classics today were published, like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, The Jungle Book, The Adventures of Pinocchio. Maybe you haven't read these books, maybe you've seen the Disney movies, but know that these were children's books before they were Disney movies. So the 1800s was also an important time because books for children really began to change. So books like Little Women, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and Treasure Island began to mark a shift in children's literature. So these books were different from children's literature of the past because they tended to have more action and adventure. For example, if you've ever read Little Women or perhaps seen a movie based on Little Women, you might be familiar with the protagonist, Jo March. She was very spunky and defied the conventions of her time. She was almost like the first feminist, right? Whereas if you've ever read Tom Sawyer or Treasure Island, like those books have lots of action and adventure. And this trend became more common over time, but these were some of the first books to include adventure stories and action in them. So this was also a new time of development in illustrations. Printing techniques improved with advances in technology, and picture books for children became even more elaborate. And as a result, we saw increased prominence of children's illustrators like Randolph Caldecott. That name might ring a bell. You've probably heard of the Caldecott Medal, which is also a very prestigious children's book award. It's meant to honor outstanding picture books published for children in the United States, and that's where it gets its name from, Randolph Caldecott. Kate Greenaway was another very prominent children's illustrator, and I believe that there is a book award named for her in the United Kingdom. So the period between 1900 and 1950, so that first half of the 20th century, we began to see the emergence of what we consider to be the first modern picture books. So prior to the publication of The Tale of Peter Rabbit in the early 1900s, picture books for children tended to have illustrations that were more like decorative, whereas modern picture books tend to synthesize the illustrations along with the words. So the pictures are also telling the story. And we're going to get into what that means later on in the semester when we study picture books. But for now, just understand, like books that are considered to be modern picture books did not emerge until the early 1900s. So Peter Rabbit was published in the United Kingdom, whereas the first picture book published for American children was Millions of Cats, and that book also received a Newbery Honor Award in the late 1920s. A lot of other books that are considered classics today were also published during this time, like The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is one that many of us are familiar with either through the book or from the movie. That's considered the first modern fantasy book published for American children. A lot of other books that you probably know were also published during this time. I'm sure many of you might be familiar with Goodnight Moon, Madeline, Make Way for Ducklings, The Secret Garden, Anne of Green Gables. All of those books emerged during this time period of the early 20th century. And this period in time was also important because some of the major children's book awards were established by the Association for Library Service to Children. So for example, the Newbery Medal was established in 1922 because a group of librarians decided, there are more and more children's books being published and we need to honor the ones that are the most outstanding. And some years later, in 1938, the Caldecott Medal was developed to recognize outstanding picture books. And we're going to talk more about these awards as time goes on in the semester. The 1950s were also an important time. This marked a time when the first books for very early readers, young children, were published. Chances are you've probably at least heard of The Cat in the Hat. You might also be familiar with Little Bear. Those books came out during that time. And some other classics that children still love today were published, like Charlotte's Web. When I visit elementary schools and I observe lessons, I still see lessons being taught about Charlotte's Web. It's remained very popular over time. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from the Chronicles of Narnia, that was also published in the 1950s. So things began to change in the 1960s. As you know, the 1960s were a time of social unrest and a lot of changes, a lot of progressive movements toward greater social and political equality for different groups of people. And we began to see that reflected more and more in children's literature. So in the 1960s, the federal government began giving large grants to school libraries, and as a result of that, the children's publishing industry began to grow, and more children's books were being published. In the 1960s, reflecting social times, we also began to see more tough topics being addressed. So one book that was very controversial in the 1960s was Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak. A lot of you might be familiar with that book. And if you're familiar with the book, you know that Max, the young boy in the book, defies his mother, and he's told he can't have his supper. So he goes on this imaginary journey where he becomes king of the wild things. At the time that book was published, the fact that Max was defying his mother and standing up to her was very edgy. And for that reason, the book was controversial. Likewise, Harriet the Spy, in that book, Harriet defies her parents. That was also considered very edgy as well. So we began to see books that were more and more realistic and reflecting the actual behaviors of children versus presenting this sugar-coated, sanitized version of childhood. The 1960s were also important. The publication of The Snowy Day was considered a very important moment in the history of children's literature because The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats won the Caldecott Medal. It received a lot of positive attention, and some people might consider that to be one of the first books about African American people that depicts them in ways that are not stereotypical. There are arguments that on the other side of that too, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of our presentation here, but that was considered an important book at its time, and of course it has remained very popular over time. I'm sure many of you have likely read The Snowy Day or at least seen the cover, which you see here on this slide. So diversity in children's literature began receiving attention in other ways during the 1960s. Mildred Batchelder was a children's librarian who advocated that children's literature should help facilitate global understanding, and the Batchelder Award was established in the mid-1960s to honor her. So the Batchelder Award honors children's books that originally were published in another country and in a language besides English, brought over to the United States, translated into English, and published for the enjoyment of American children. So if you have any interest in reading international books, I would recommend seeking out books that have received the Batchelder Award. Also, the Coretta Scott King Award was established a year after the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that book award honors outstanding African American authors and illustrators. So the 1960s were also an important time because we began to see different genres and formats of children's book emerge. For example, a concept book, and we'll study this more when we get into nonfiction, is a book that is written for young children and illustrates some basic concepts about the world, like opposites or colors, shapes, numbers. Those are all examples of concept books. Wordless books are picture books that largely use illustrations to tell the story, not words. There could be a couple words in a wordless picture book, but generally the story or the pictures tell the story. And we also saw the emergence of baby board books in the 1960s, and you've probably seen these. They're books that are usually very thick, but they have a small number, or not too many pages, but the book is, usually about yay big. And the pages are very thick. They're made out of cardboard. They're meant for very tiny little fingers to flip the pages. So those are board books. So in the 1970s, it became increasingly common for children's literature to handle difficult topics. Some of you might be familiar with Judy Blume. Her books were especially controversial and actually remain controversial. She's one of the most, her books are some of the most banned books in the United States. But again, a topic we'll address later in the semester. For example, when I was an adolescent reader, I remember reading Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And the main character in the book questions her faith. She also begins going through puberty. So those were topics that just weren't dealt with in children's literature much up until the 1960s and the 1970s. So once again, children's literature began reflecting the real concerns of actual children instead of presenting a sanitized version of life. So African Americans also began receiving greater recognition in children's literature during this time. For example, Virginia Hamilton won the Newbery Medal in 1975. Mildred Taylor won in 1977 for Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which was one of my favorite books as a child. And in 1976, Leo Dillon, who was the co-illustrator of Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears, received the Caldecott Medal, and he was the first African American person to receive this honor. So in the 1970s, we also began to see an increased popularity of series books that had previously been published in decades past, like Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys. And one thing that might be disappointing to you if you ever read Nancy Drew growing up is that Carolyn Keene is not a real person. A bunch of unknown writers wrote Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys books. They were not actually produced by like a single author, which is the impression you might get because on the cover you always see an author noted, but that author is not a real person. So if you ever wrote a letter to Carolyn Keene thanking her for her Nancy Drew books, she didn't get it. She's not real. So disappointing, I know. All right, the 1980s and 1990s. This is when I was a child, so I can speak to some personal experience here. So in the 1980s, diversity in children's literature, which had been increasingly prevalent in the 1970s, began to decline once again. However, in the 1990s, we began seeing more and more diversity in children's literature, and in fact, in 1996, the American Library Association established the Pura Belpré Award, which is meant to honor outstanding Latina and Latino authors and illustrators, and that award is very much still in existence today. This was also a time when more and more quality nonfiction began to emerge in the children's book world. So in years past, nonfiction had a bad reputation of being kind of dry and kind of boring, but nonfiction, I believe today we're in the golden era of nonfiction. Children's nonfiction books published today are great, but we began to see that trend towards quality nonfiction emerge in the 1980s. And in fact, in the 1980s, the Newbery Medal was awarded to a nonfiction book, Lincoln, a Photobiography by Russell Friedman, for the very first time. We also began to see more attention given to books of poetry. For example, A Visit to William Blake's Inn won the Newbery Medal in the early 1980s. In 1996, Out of the Dust was another poetry book that received the Newbery Medal. So poetry became a lot more prominent in children's literature during this time. There were a number of paperback series that were very popular during this time period. As a young child, I remember going to the library and snatching up any babysitter's book club or babysitter's book that they had available, or Goosebumps as well by R.L. Stine. Those books were very popular in the 1980s and 1990s, and I think they've made a comeback since then. Also American Girls. Some of you might remember the American Girl dolls, but there was also a book series that went along with the dolls. I remember really enjoying those as a young child. Printing technology also began to advance during this time, so children's picture books became even more vibrant and colorful. And we'll look at this later in the semester, but you might notice that children's picture books that were published early in the 20th century have very limited color palettes. Like you might only see like one or two colors, whereas now we see every color of the rainbow in children's picture books. So whole language teaching also became popular during this time, and if you're familiar with whole language teaching from some of your other courses, there was a great emphasis in that teaching approach on using authentic children's books, so that increased the demand for more children's literature. And because of that increased demand, we began to see the emergence of school-based book clubs. You might be familiar with Scholastic, and that might be one of the only ones available today, or one of the only ones that are very popular today. But there used to be others like Trumpet and Troll. So there were several school-based book clubs that allowed teachers and students to purchase children's books at a discount. And during this time, publishing houses really started emphasizing profits. I mean, of course, publishers have also always cared about making money off books, presumably, but profit became even more important during this time. So publishers began producing children's books authored by celebrities, thinking that the name recognition would boost book sales. I have some strong feelings about that, but that's a sidebar. Anyway, we also began to see publishers adding tie-ins to their books. For example, if you buy the book, you get a plush toy to increase book sales. So, all right, now we're into the 2000s. So during this time, we see about 14,000 books for children and young adults published in any given year in the United States. So that's a lot of books being published, a lot to keep up with. And the American Library Association and its divisions for children and young adults also began to establish some new awards. The Prince Award is an award that is intended to honor outstanding books for young adults. The Cybert Medal, which was first awarded in 2001, honors outstanding nonfiction books for children. And I had the privilege of serving on the 2018 Cybert Medal Committee, so I actually got to choose the books that received the award in 2018, and I'll talk with you more about that experience when we get to our nonfiction unit later in the semester. And the Geisel Medal was established to honor outstanding books for very young readers, and again, we'll talk about that more. So I know I'm giving you a preview of a lot of different topics that we're going to cover this semester, but hopefully I'm whetting your appetite for all the great things that we're going to discuss later. So at this time in the 2000s, we also saw this interesting trend where the lines between books for children and the books for adults began to become blurred. So Harry Potter is enormously popular, right? And we saw adults and children, and still see adults and children reading Harry Potter books. Are they children's books? Are they books for everybody? The verdict's out. I would also make the same argument about if you've ever heard of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I still am not sure. Is that a children's book, a young adult book, a book for everybody? Not really sure. So there's some fuzziness there. We don't have necessarily clear distinctions between children's books and adult books. And in fact, I might argue that line is becoming even more blurred because a lot of adult readers are enjoying books that are really intended for young adults, like adolescent readers. So I guess the verdict is that books are for all. There is no age range necessarily. And of course, with the Common Core state standards, as well as some research by literacy scholars, nonfiction books and reading nonfiction books has received a lot of increased attention in educational settings. So educators today now recognize that reading nonfiction is very important for children's literacy development. And of course, our standards reflect an emphasis or an increased emphasis on reading children's nonfiction. So during the 2000s, more and more educators began considering the inclusion of nonfiction in their elementary classrooms. So what's going on in the children's literature world today? So there has been a greater emphasis on diversity in children's books in recent years. You may have heard of the We Need Diverse Books campaign, which is now a nonprofit organization, and they are dedicated to publishing outstanding diverse books for young people. They're not a publisher, but they advocate for the publication of outstanding diverse books. And there's also a movement called Own Voices, and an author will write an Own Voices book if he or she or they is writing a book based on their own experiences and own background. And we'll get into that more actually in the next unit when we discuss multicultural and diverse children's literature. But an Own Voices book is essentially when you're writing from your own experience about a cultural group that may have been traditionally marginalized in children's literature. So anyway, so some different book types that have emerged over this time. Ebooks have become increasingly popular. They now represent about 25% of the share of the book market. Although with the pandemic and with bookstores being closed and libraries being closed for some period of time, I do wonder if ebooks are going to become more popular, but we'll see how that goes. Also, there's been an increase in demand for young adult books, middle grade books, as well as board books. And at the same time, there's been decreased demand for picture books. And part of the reason for that is that parents are wanting their children to read advanced books, and some parents don't understand necessarily the literary value that picture books have, and also all the things that picture books can offer in terms of children's literacy development. So it seems like there's a perception that picture books are easy readers that children shouldn't really spend a lot of time looking at. That's not true, but some people believe that and have that perception. So there's also been a greater emphasis, as we just talked about, on the publication of nonfiction books for children. I just think, in my personal opinion, that nonfiction is getting better and better. I love nonfiction. I know that having taught this course for several years, a lot of students come into this class not liking nonfiction, but I'm going to change your mind. So get ready for that. We also see visuals becoming increasingly important in children's literature. Like, we see a lot more graphic novels being published. These are immensely popular books. Chances are you've probably seen a child in one of your internships with a graphic novel, and we'll study those too. And wordless pictures have also become increasingly popular. And as the semester proceeds, we'll talk about some additional trends in children's literature.